Okay, well it's a great privilege for me to introduce someone whom I've known through the Faculty of Divinity. We were overlapped there for quite some years, and I think I used you to supervise some of my students and so on. Yeah, Rosie in fact, case in point. Liz has a long-standing interest in human strengths, virtues and so on, and she worked in the Faculty of Divinity doing her PhD as an interdisciplinary evaluation of psychological approaches to strengths and virtues. And she's now working at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham, looking at gratitude, forgiveness, humility, compassion, and exploring the interconnection between them. So over to you, Liz.
Great. Well, thanks very much to the Faraday Institute and to Hilary in particular for inviting me to speak today. I hope everybody is still fighting fit for the last session. I'm going to focus, the sort of subheading of this Believing Brain conference was Neuroscience, Psychology and Faith. I'm afraid there won't be any neuroscience in this, but there will be quite a lot of psychology and there will be some faith as well. So 2 out of 3 at any rate. Okay, so here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about different emphases in psychological and theological approaches to 3 particular virtues: forgiveness, gratitude and hope. And as I go through this, I think it would be helpful actually if anybody can think of any answers to these questions that perhaps I don't cover in what I'm about to say. So to bear in mind, what's the value of these virtues or strengths within those different discourses? What the grounds are for forgiveness or for gratitude or for hope, so what grounds them? And the question of what ends are served by forgiveness, gratitude and hope. Now obviously I'm going to suggest some answers to those questions, but if anybody would like to suggest some more, that's all to the good for me. So first of all, I'll start with forgiveness. Now of course it's central to Christian theology and central, I think, to most religious traditions, the idea that people make mistakes and we want to kind of release those people from negative feelings that may bring about, and is quite likely to bring about. But the sort of psychological interest in forgiveness began really in earnest in the 1980s and the 1990s, but it's sort of mushroomed really with the rise of positive psychology. Now somebody asked me earlier on, I think it was Rebecca, what positive psychology is. And so for anybody who also might like to know, I'll give a quick summary of positive psychology. It's an approach to psychology that focuses on what is right with people, so people's strengths, and not on what might be wrong with people, how to fix certain pathologies. Now, there are certain people in the positive psychology movement who have perhaps tried to make out that ordinary psychology is excessively negative and gloomy and focusing on what's wrong with people. And this new positive psychology is different, and it focuses on what's right. I think that's a little bit of a crude characterisation of psychology as normal and positive psychology. But I do think that it's important to emphasise what can be right with people, even in the midst of quite debilitating pathology as well. So I think the interest in strengths is quite an important complement to psychology, although it's not actually anything as new as some of the positive psychologists make out. And in my PhD I was looking at precursors of positive psychology, humanistic psychology, and in salutogenesis as well, Antonovsky's concept. Anyway, going back to forgiveness, positive psychology tends to emphasise the role of forgiveness in emotional regulation. And I think most of the psychological definitions of forgiveness that I've come across tend to focus on granting forgiveness, not on appropriating forgiveness. Because if you stop for a moment and think about the word forgiveness, it could mean both, couldn't it? being forgiven and forgiving others. But most of the psychological literature tends to focus on the forgiver, on the forgiving of other people. Now, the topic of forgiveness was my first interdisciplinary love back in 1998. So I finished my theology degree, which I did in Oxford, and one of the papers there was on the psychology of religion. And I was very interested in the whole question of, all matters of psychology and religion, but particularly on forgiveness, because I thought that psychology had a lot to offer in terms of how forgiveness might be affected. And so I wrote to Fraser Watts, who of course is here in Cambridge, and I said that I was interested in pursuing an interest in psychology of religion. And I ended up meeting him on Coventry Railway Station platform. He was holding a copy of The Psychologist, so I could recognise him. And then we had a covert interview, I later discovered, at the end of which he said, well, you know, I think you could come to Cambridge and do an MPhil on this. That MPhil, which I did on theological and psychological aspects of forgiveness, was the impetus for this book that we co-edited quite a long time ago now, where we were trying to bring theology and psychology into dialogue on the question of forgiveness. So as I say, in positive psychology, it's often seen as this way of affecting emotional repair and neutralising negative emotions in the person seeking to forgive. And by negative emotions, I'm not sure I agree that we should categorise emotions by valence entirely, because sometimes something negative could be positive in the right context, if you see what I mean. But anyway, resentment, hatred, and so on. Those are the negative emotions that are in mind. And Martin Seligman, who is, if you like, the chief, the head honcho of positive psychology, he talks about forgiveness and how he doesn't want to preach about it. So he says his aim is merely to expose the inverse relationship between unforgiveness and life satisfaction. So, you know, if you can forgive, you will be happier. But I think there's a risk there of grounding, when I was talking earlier on about how these strengths are grounded, there's a risk of grounding instrumentally there, purely for its salutary benefit. And as I say, I think this emphasises the forgiver and doesn't really emphasise being forgiven. And yet we may have just as much difficulty, I think, in appropriating forgiveness than we do in actually granting forgiveness. But there's not as much literature in psychology about that. Whereas, talking from a sort of Christian theological perspective, it's human nature to fall short. I think that's Romans 3:25. But I could be corrected on that if I've got that wrong. All have sinned, all have fallen short of the glory of God. And that recognises, if you like, this universal human need for forgiveness. And I think that within theology, Christian theology I'm talking about, forgiveness is as much received because of we're all being in the same boat, we've all fallen short. It's as much received and appropriated as it is extended and offered to others. And that extended forgiveness is potentiated by having received forgiveness oneself. Now I think that's actually, it's not just a theological point, it's a developmental point actually as well, point of view of developmental psychology, that in order to understand what forgiveness is, you need to have been forgiven, quite likely by your parents, I would imagine. To know that when you do wrong, sometimes there's a way forward, that and a new future can be conceived. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about ways of promoting forgiveness in psychological interventions. So I'm talking now about the how of forgiveness. And there are two main sort of approaches. One of them is a largely cognitive approach, and it centres on reworking the attributions of blame that you've made towards the offender. And the other actually begins with affect, it begins with the emotion side, trying to cultivate compassion and empathy towards the offender. And I think that this actually fleshes out what may be an abstract ideal of forgiveness. This is actually, it's one thing to say forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, but how do we actually go about forgiving? And I think psychology does shed some light on that. So the first of those two psychological approaches, the cognitive reframing approach, is particularly identified with a chap called Robert Enright. And he's got a 20-stage model of forgiveness. Now, I've pared it down here to the 4 main stages because I thought we really haven't got the time. And we're all quite tired, I think, at this point. Another guy who basically adopts a kind of cognitive reframing approach as well is a chap called Lewis Smedes, in a book called Forgive and Forget, Healing the Hurts We Don't Deserve. And he uses a metaphor of the magic eyes, he calls it, seeing offence with the magic eyes, and that's a metaphor for the process of reframing. So the 4 main phases anyway. First of all, the uncovering phase, where there's a recognition of the wrongdoing. And I think that's important because it means that you're recognising that something was done to you without denial, without minimisation, without any other defence mechanisms, for want of a better expression. In the next phase, there's a decision to be made about whether you're going to forgive or whether you're going to retaliate, called the decision phase. And then at phase 12, the work phase begins, and that's where this process of reframing goes on. And the idea is that you reframe the wrongdoer by placing that person in context. You're looking to see what factors, both recent factors or more distal factors, might have led that person to behave the way they did. Now, I'll give you an example. For example, somebody could have been particularly stressed, and then you think, well, they didn't mean to snap at me, they're going through a lot of stress, so that would be obviously one of the more proximal causes. Or a more distal cause, a bit officer abruptly, on account that he hadn't had a normal home. That actually you might be looking at somebody's history and actually realising that there are reasons why people behave the way they do, developmentally and so on. So the idea is that by doing this reframing, you actually come to generate an empathic approach towards the person who wronged you. And then you go into the sort of deepening phase of finding meaning in the suffering, of obviously the sort of negative feelings decreasing towards the person who wronged you, at the same time an increase of positive emotions as well. So in this model, the affective change, the sort of emotional change, comes about through this process of cognitive reappraisal. Now, just a caveat, I think, that I will throw in at this point. Some people might say that reframing the person and looking at what factors might have led to something is in the end excusing somebody or condoning somebody. And so there are some questions about to what extent that process actually is almost a sort of manifestation of to understand all is to forgive all. And of course you might not, particularly for a heinous offence, you might never be able to understand all. So there is that caveat there. The other main approach is one where you actually begin by trying to generate empathy towards the person who wronged you. And this is the model of Everett Worthington. It's called the REACH model. And as you'll see from those bold, it's an acronym. So for each phase of the process, only 5 stages this time rather than 20. But he has the idea that a state of unforgiveness comes about as a result of a sort of conditioning process. And that leads to a desire to either retaliate against an offender or to kind of withdraw and to avoid them. So he suggests that what you need to do is you need to kind of decondition the response to the stimulus, to the offender. And you do so by recalling hurts initially in a supportive environment. And that kind of imaginative exposure to the offender will help to kind of weaken the power of that sort of association. And then at the next stage, you empathise with the offender. You think how they must feel now in the wake of the offence. Now, there's a caveat here, of course, isn't there? Because whilst I might, have been snapped at by a colleague at work, and I'm close to that colleague, and I think to myself, she must be feeling terrible. She didn't mean to kind of sound off like that. I feel really bad for her, and I can make her feel better. I can tell her that I forgive her. I think in that situation, empathy might be pretty easy to come by. But of course, there's questions of scale here, and of course, we mustn't ignore the fact that there may be good reasons for thinking that the offender actually doesn't feel terrible in the wake of the offence. They might not even know what they've done. They could be completely ignorant. Or in these kind of stories that get into the news of people who are seeking to forgive murderers of family members and so on, you probably would be feeling inclined to empathise with them, or you might even think that those people were psychopathic and they're not going to be feeling terrible in the wake of the offence. So there is a question about scale here, I think, about the scope of what it is you're trying to forgive. Anyway, Worthington has a kind of an approach to forgiveness where it's potentiated by other virtues. And one of those virtues is humility, so you reflect on times when you've wronged others. I mean, you could, for example, be reflecting explicitly that we've all fallen short. And that's humility might help people to give the gift of forgiveness. He also talks about how being grateful, the gratitude for having been forgiven yourself, could potentiate forgiveness. So you've got empathy or compassion, you've got humility, you've got gratitude, that are all kind of working towards helping to forgive someone. And then in the final stages, he suggests that people make a commitment to forgive, maybe signing and dating a letter, because life being what it is, we inevitably look back on things, we have memories of that person that are not positive, and at least if we've kind of shown our intention to forgive at that point in time, it may kind of help us feel that we are on a path to forgiveness, even if at times it's difficult to kind of grasp it. So I think it's fair to say that psychology helps with the how of forgiveness. It tries to flesh out ways of helping people to forgive, making it not just a kind of an abstract ideal of forgiveness. It provides these tools, and I haven't got the statistics with me today, but those interventions that I've put up there have been used in a variety of different contexts, clinical contexts. Obviously quite a few of them have been trials with students as well. Some of them have been part of brief therapy, some of them have been part of a longer therapy, but they have been empirically shown to help people to forgive. I do think there's a danger, though, of some of these psychological approaches being advocated purely for the salutary benefits to the forgiver and sort of losing sight on the need to be forgiven. And I think religion seems to balance up that need for being forgiven and forgiving better than the psychological approaches. But I think actually that psychology there's no reason why it couldn't focus more on how people appropriate forgiveness, and instead of looking at stages of forgiving other people, to look at stages of how people actually accept forgiveness from other people. So here's a little summary that I've drawn up of theological and psychological emphases. As I say, the motivation for forgiveness, I think, in positive psychology is often for the benefits to the person forgiving. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, by the way. Obviously, people who've been wronged deserve to feel better. But it's explicit about that as a motivation. Whereas I think in theology it's more of a sense of solidarity with other people who also make mistakes. The emphasis is different, as I've said, on the forgiver, or whether we look at our need for forgiveness and our need to forgive. I think this is an interesting point, this next one, about how forgiveness is affected, because of course within a psychological approach, most of those interventions are intrapersonal processes. So it's something that they go through those steps, they try to reframe the offender, they're sort of, on their own. It's an individual process for the most part. Whereas, of course, if you believe in God, you have somebody there who you can call on to help you to forgive. So what might not seem humanly possible, and you feel you can't do it in the strength of your own resources, might be divinely so. And so you could hand that forgiveness to God in prayer, and that could actually, if you like, make you feel that even if you can't forgive, it may be possible for a person to be forgiven at the time. So there's a kind of co-agent there. And then the goal, what is the goal of forgiveness? Is it increasing this positive effect and decreasing negative effect in the forgiver, an emotional release? Of course, theology also stresses the fact that forgiveness is about release. And in fact, the words in the Greek New Testament, a couple of those words actually signify that they literally mean, Mike's nodding here, aphasis, apoluo, those words literally mean to release, either from a debt or it's the word used to kind of release at the start of a race. So release characterises that too, but there's often an emphasis theologically on reconciliation if possible. Most of the stories in the New Testament that are about forgiveness involve people coming together about, it's an interpersonal as opposed to an intrapersonal process. Right, so that's forgiveness anyway. I'm now going to change tack and talk about gratitude. As you'll see, this is a couple of years ago now, but this is a school in Castle Bromwich, which is where Fort Dunlop is if you're on the M6. And they're using some materials that I've created there, a storybook about gratitude, to try and tap primary school children 9 to 11 years old, their understanding of gratitude and the factors that influence gratitude. Now, the research questions that I inherited when I joined the Jubilee Centre were these. At the moment, I'm actually doing some experimental work with gratitude. I'm actually doing interventions to promote gratitude and to look at how that relates to compassion. But the first stage of the research was pretty much conceptual. We were examining what lay people understand by gratitude. We looked at what people are grateful for, what sort of things come out, what values placed on gratitude in society, whether some people are more grateful than others, and on that note we've developed a new questionnaire of gratitude which is under submission at the moment. It's called the multi-component gratitude measure, and it measures emotions associated with grateful emotion. It measures gratitude-related behaviours that people engage in and people's attitude towards gratitude as well. And yes, we've used that measure. Some people are more grateful than others. That's, I suppose, a given, isn't it? And then we looked at the question of whether and how gratitude should be promoted. And the report, which is downloadable from the Jubilee Centre website, was launched on 4th of February at the British Academy by Michael Mosley, who you might know from the TV. So if anybody wants to see that report, as I say, you can just download it off our website. So gratitude in positive psychology, what are the emphases there? It's usually put forward as a means of capitalising on positive events. Martin Seligman again talks about how gratitude amplifies subjective well-being or happiness. And he talks about keeping a gratitude journal with the express intention of that gratitude journal being to increase life satisfaction and happiness. Now, it's amazing actually what people have found. I'm just talking about some other people's research here now about gratitude interventions. But in 2003, Bob Emmons and Mike McCulloch showed that if you keep a gratitude journal, you write down 3 or more things that you're grateful for each day over a 2-week period, there's a significant impact of that on well-being. Now, this was done with inevitably university students, but then actually it was also repeated with patients with neuromuscular diseases as well. And a summary of what they found was that people who kept this journal for just 2 weeks had better sleep, fewer symptoms of illness. They actually measured how many painkillers people took, which of course was especially important in the case of the people with neuromuscular disease. Increased happiness or subjective well-being, increased positive emotion and decreased negative emotion. So guess what? It turns out that counting your blessings really is a good idea. So it sort of corroborates a bit of age-old wisdom there. And those journals, as I say, have been used in clinical contexts as well. Alex Wood, whom I know, reported to me in these studies that in 2 clinical samples of people who were keeping a gratitude journal, and they were just writing down 3 things for a 2-week period that they were grateful for. Over a 2-week period, it reduced worrying of people with a clinical diagnosis of depression as much as CBT, not more than CBT, as much as cognitive behavioural therapy. And it reduced body dissatisfaction in people who were diagnosed with a disorder of that sort, again as much as cognitive behavioural therapy. Now the interesting thing though is that when they were asked about the interventions and which they preferred, people said that they really enjoyed keeping the gratitude journal, whereas the CBT exercises were perceived to be more like work. And actually a lot of people spontaneously, Alex found, after the study, just kept on keeping the journal. But the same wasn't true of the CBT group. I mean, obviously they would have internalised a lot of aspects of cognitive behavioural therapy, but they didn't carry on with it in the same sustained way as the people who had the gratitude journaling. Another way that gratitude has been promoted in psychology is through a gratitude visit, whereby somebody writes a thank you letter to somebody they've never expressed thanks to properly, and then they actually go round and read out the thank you letter, leave the thank you letter with that person and so on. And Martin Seligman has used this intervention quite a lot. It began actually as part of his Masters in Applied Positive Psychology group. Somebody had the idea that this would be a good way of promoting gratitude. It turns out that student, who he does actually name, but I can't remember her name, was right. And what you'll see is that in this particular study, people in the gratitude visit condition, as opposed to placebo control, that was people who were writing about early memories. There was quite an increase in happiness immediately after the visit, and that sort of endured for about a month. At 3 months, the effect wasn't significant anymore. It's interesting actually, I don't know why this is, maybe somebody's got an idea, but the actual control group was quite high as well there. Obviously not as high as the gratitude group. But the more interesting thing is, in terms of depressive symptoms, you can really see how in the gratitude visit group it dropped quite a lot as well, and that effect endured for about the same amount of time as well. And actually gratitude is one of the big areas, if you like, of positive psychology, because it has consistently been shown to boost subjective well-being. And so for that reason it's been incorporated quite a lot in school interventions, positive education interventions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show a film, and I want you to bear in mind what I've just been saying about how positive psychology tends to emphasise gratitude as a means of capitalising on positive events. And I just want you to bear that idea in mind while I show this video.
If you knew I was dying, would it change you? If you knew I was dying, would it change? If you knew I was dying, would it change you? If you knew I was dying, would it change?
My name's Lance, aka Freedom. I'm from East London, and I'm talk about things that I'm grateful for. Some of the things I'm grateful for. These kids are great. So yeah, I thought before I started talking about gratitude, I'll talk about myself and my past. I've been an ex-gang member from the age of 9 to 15, and I got stabbed 5 times down the line. So being in gangs really changed me. I lost friends down the line, 7 to be exact. So right about now, I'm not grateful for nothing. That's my past. I'm gonna do a poem called Never Stop Dreaming. I'm sitting here in the dark, reminiscing. While I'm hearing that devil in my right ear trying to ram me on my past, but I'm quick to man him with his future. Could you see me when I put pen to paper, my pen starts to bleed and my paper starts to capture light, but wait, when I write I don't edit, it's the way that God said it. But it wasn't all pretty, no pretty stories, cause I used to roll in the cold roads, know a couple of men who died cause of postcodes. Couple of men riding with a gun in the side bag, knife in the right side, and a bandana on that damn left side. But I look up in the sky and I scream out why, but I look up on the floor and I see tears washed by, hitting drains, blood stains that can't get washed away. So I try to disturb just like an aeroplane. Certain mans are too busy trying to take man, so I try to be that great man with that great plan. Call me Martin Luther King cause I have a dream. And as long as I'm alive, I'ma keep chasing it. Let them haters hate. Cause there's so many steps that I need to take. No time for that tea break, no Chris Brown. But look at me now, I'm a new man, so I stepped in the Lord's hands. No David Cameron. But I've gone from hoods to suits, from trainers to shoots. Now I scream at NSD. Never stop dreaming because dreams can come true. And what's stopping me being that black MP? Representing for the kids in the down the streets.
So I got kicked out of school, sadly, due to my behaviour and the facts that I was having and the disrespect that I was towards teachers. But saying that, I'm grateful for it really opened my eyes that I got kicked out due to I got an opportunity to go to a unit. And going to that unit, I started knowing more about myself and started realising and started growing up more. So obviously, without saying what I'm grateful for, I need to know about me. I never had the best upbringing. I wouldn't say let's put it this way, I never had a silver spoon or a gold spoon, I had a plastic spoon in my mouth. Never had my mum or my dad there. Dad left me 2 weeks after I was born. Mum got a new boyfriend, got abused by then. Then got moved to my nan's and, you know, things were just difficult. When primary school struggled, because I had dyslexic, but never knew I was dyslexic until I went to college. So for me, all the bad things that I used to do, going to school late, if you look, my house is like 10 to 20 seconds away from my secondary school and I still find myself late. Saying that now, all the bad things that I used to do used to hurt the ones that I loved. So it made me understand and made me open up my eyes when I did get kicked out that I'm on my last straw. How many times I have to get stabbed until it's game over for me? So for me, I'm grateful for everything, the bad things as well, because the bad things has made me who I am now. Because without that, I wouldn't be the person I am now. And I wouldn't live and thrive to do youth work and work with other kids.
What inspired you to change?
I haven't really expressed what I'm grateful for. You see, losing friends down the line really opened me up. Getting kicked out of school really opened my eyes. The people around me really said to me, I'll never make it. Said to me that I'll never do something in life, I'll never succeed. And I wanted to prove them wrong. So me hearing all the negative things really changed me. And for that, I'm grateful for all the negative things that I received. But you see, as a poet, I have my own motto. I am who I am. That the things that I do for other kids, hopefully I've changed their life. And they may be doing a video just like this and saying what they're grateful for. See, I'm the definition of impossible, because I am possible.
So I think in that film, incidentally, that film was created for the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues Thank You Film Awards, which we've had running for a few years. The idea is that children between the ages of 5 and 16 create a film around the theme of thank you. And that film there, I think, shows that there's a bit more to gratitude than just being grateful for good things. So I think that particular emphasis within positive psychology, it may be right that gratitude can help us savour and capitalise on positive things, but I think it loses sight of the fact that actually there's something quite redemptive about gratitude. And I think that's within a theistic framework, people give thanks for everything. As it says in Thessalonians, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And that's the theme, giving thanks in everything, of a recent book by Rowan Williams and Joan Chichester. And there they describe our lives as a bundle of gifts wrapped in darkness. And I think that's the thing, isn't it, from a sort of theistic perspective, everything is received from God's hand, and life itself is seen as a gift. So it's not just about the good things. It may be pretty hard to be thankful for the bad things. I'm certainly not saying that, but there can be something redemptive about gratitude. And of course there is that emphasis as well that we give gratitude. It's a gift of thanks to honour the giver. We don't say our thank yous just for the increments in subjective well-being that might come about as a result. So I think there is that difference between being grateful to one's benefactors to honour their goodness, or just from a sense of joie de vivre, and being grateful, because it's good for you, basically. I think there's a difference there between whether we're seeing ourselves more in the forefront or whether we're seeing others in the forefront. Because I think gratitude connects us to other people. It shows that we are not the sole architects of the good in our lives. And we're not the sole condition for our own success either. So I think there is that kind of difference in focus, really, between the beneficiary and the benefactor in positive psychology and in theology. But of course, I'm not saying that those interventions are a bad thing. I think they're very important. They've also been quite robust. That gratitude diary, for instance, I can say anecdotally, when I've gone through periods of doing it myself, it does have a bit of a positive feedback loop. And as good things happen, you're thinking to yourself, oh, I'll remember that later today and give thanks for it. So I can certainly, I do try to take my own medicine, and I can certainly say that it does help. But I do think that we should be aware of locating the benefits of gratitude for the individual instrumentally. We don't want to reduce gratitude to just being about emotional repair or capitalising on good things. And as I say, I think, and as Lance was saying, gratitude can be redemptive. And actually that's a key theological theme, but it's recently becoming popular within psychology in terms of this concept of post-traumatic growth, which I think is something that Joanna knows quite a bit about and has written about as well. So I'm going to change, and in the final, I think I've got 10 minutes, talk about optimism and hope in psychology. It's one of the strengths of what's called the VIA, the Values in Action Classification, which Martin Seligman and Christopher Peterson put together, one of 24 universally valued cross-cultural strengths. Gratitude is also in that bunch of 24, so is forgiveness as well. And of course this has meant that there has been more research in these domains, actually, as a result of positive psychological interest in them. And of course optimism is important in increasing resilience, and it's also in decreasing depression as well. And I think I argued in my PhD that actually one of the first topics of positive psychology, if you like, before it was launched in 2000 with great fanfare, was actually the concept of learned optimism. And in that, Seligman in effect turned on its head the kind of theories of what sustained depression, what kind of cognitive theories sustained depression, and if you like, flipped it to talk about how to increase optimism. So again, I'm talking about Authentic Happiness, this book by Martin Seligman, a self-help book. He's obviously written a lot more, but he talks about positive emotions about the future, and optimism is one of those. Almost like a hedonic resource, it can make you happier if you're more optimistic, and of course there is a lot of evidence to show that. But it's founded, or grounded, to use my word earlier on a confidence that's based, I think, on self-control, on self-confidence and beliefs about personal agency. So, for example, optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles are characterised by different attributions in terms of the self or the other, in terms of how long a situation kind of lasts, and in terms of how much a bad circumstance, if you like, would infect other domains. So the pessimistic person with a pessimistic explanatory style, locates the cause of failure internally. It's their fault. Whereas an optimistic explanatory style person locates it externally. The optimist sees it as something that won't endure, that won't last, whereas a pessimistic person would actually say, well, it will always be like this. And the pessimist will say, well, this bleeds into all areas of my life, whereas the optimistic person sees it in a more discrete way. So these are the attributional profiles of failing an exam. Now the thing is, what Seligman says is you can actually change people's profiles here. And so you can make somebody who's got more of a pessimistic explanatory style into more of an optimistic person by actually getting them to examine these ways they attribute causes for things and to actually kind of, if you like, minimise the damage, if you like, of those pessimistic explanatory style attributions. Another theory of hope in positive psychology is Snyder's hope theory, and their hope consists of two kinds of thinking: agency thinking and pathways thinking. And agency thinking is believing oneself to be capable of attaining a goal. Pathways thinking is being able to think of ways to reach that goal. Now the question is, there may be something to this, but is it all that hope consists of? And as I say, I think what hope is grounded in optimistic explanatory style, the ground of hope there is a confidence that's based on the self's ability to change and to manipulate those beliefs, to change those attributional profiles. In terms of hope theory, the agency pathways, that privileges beliefs about personal agency, the little train that could, if you believe you can, alongside goal setting and then finding ways to reach those goals. And so in that sense, they're being construed, hope and optimism, as internal and largely cognitive processes that are amenable to conscious control. But what I would say about this is that I think it's important. I think it will to buoy up people's beliefs about their mastery of situation and to help people to try to limit, if you like, those sorts of cognitive attributions that are deleterious to the person. I think that's important. But I think it doesn't take account of hope's collective or shared dimension, a different kind of confidence, the confidence of trust. And I think that's emphasised in theology. We hope in, it's not just hope in that, we hope in other people. And this is actually something that was touched on by Irene on Friday evening when she was talking about, she said, trust does something in the patient. And I think also today, earlier on this morning, when Julian was talking about treating people with dementia like children makes them start to become like children. I think that's the thing. There's a collective dimension of hope which is sustained in relation to other agents. It's not this sort of purely interior personal resource, and that's very clear in a sort of theological perspective, but it kind of falls out of the picture, I think, in terms of psychology. So, as I say, expectations of significant others influence this fundamental hope. And so, I think somebody may be beyond the point of self-help. They may be reading that book, they may be trying to change their, attributions or whatever. They may have every intention of doing it. But actually, when people are extremely depressed, they may just not have the ability to do that. But if you can have somebody to kindle hope, that actually opens up the future. And of course, it could be trusting one's therapist, that could be that sharing. It could be belief in God. But the point is that hope isn't this purely internal resource. That paper, Cobler and Stockland, that was about, I said it's a long ago now, but it was about an epidemic of suicides in a psychiatric hospital, and it was a study which showed how expectations of significant people in the field influence the likelihood of people committing suicide in a hospital, I'm afraid. But if you can kindle this hope, then obviously people aren't on their own. So there is this collective dimension. Another thing I want to mention is Lynch, who is a psychoanalyst, or he was, also a Roman Catholic priest, he talked about the role of imagination in sustaining hope, and that actually you need to kind of put on, he puts it this way, the imagination of another. So a person who can imagine a way out of the situation, when actually the depressed person, their vista of the future is contracted to a point where their imagination is not able to kind of make that leap. I think the other thing is that we also hope for things that are outside our control. And that is an aspect of the psychology of hope that obviously is emphasised, because it's about what you can do, and I think that's important, obviously. But it doesn't talk about how sometimes we do hope genuinely for things that are outside our control. So I think the positive psychological models, as I say, promote these salutary or positive styles of thinking that prioritise the self-determined aspects of hope or optimism. And there are self-determined aspects. I'm just thinking that they're perhaps not the whole story. And I think that positive psychological models and measures of hope and optimism could actually be enriched. They could take more account, perhaps, of the way in which hope is sustained in relationship to other people. We could ask people questions, clinicians questions about how much they're kind of helping people feel supported. And obviously there's a subjective assessment there that would be quite hard to do, but I think it's important at least to recognise that there is that kind of duality there. But I do think it's good to buoy up this agency thinking, to buoy up self-confidence and self-belief, especially if it has salutary consequences, provided that we recognise that we can't effect all that we hope for in our own powers alone. I think that could actually be quite a dysfunctional belief to have, that you could just have everything if you wanted it. Hopes are often shared and kindled in trust or confidence, and I think that positive psychology could take more account of that collective dimension. So now I'm into the final few minutes, just drawing the threads together from across the different domains that I've talked about: forgiveness, gratitude and hope. I think that all three of them are often conceived within psychology, and particularly within positive psychology, as sort of personal resources. And the word strength, I suppose, conveys that idea. But I'm not convinced that they're entirely personal as such. As I say, I think there are collective dimensions of all of these things. There are collective dimensions of forgiveness, because we're in a community of people who make mistakes, so we need to be forgiven just as much as we need to forgive. Similarly, in terms of gratitude, it recognises that we are intimately connected with other people for the benefits that we have, and the sense of gratitude helps us to appreciate, I think, our connectedness with other people. And then, as I say, obviously, there are these collective dimensions of hope as well. As I've said, as I've gone along, the benefits of these strengths are often grounded instrumentally in terms of positive psychology, and the main dependent measure is often how much subjective well-being they promote, or how much of an increase in positive affect, how much of a decrease in negative affect. And I'm not a killjoy. I mean, I want to be happy, so I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that it perhaps, it potentially could kind of reduce the richness of these concepts just to being drivers of emotional regulation. As I said, psychology tends to focus on the individual forgiving or on the individual being grateful. You'll recall that all of that research that I presented earlier on was about the effect it had on the person who was being grateful, not on the person who'd had the gratitude expressed to them. Of course, there's no reason why you couldn't actually incorporate that, but it tends not to have been incorporated. And of course, the focus on the individual hoping rather than on the community's hope or collective hope. And so I think when I did my PhD, which is in some ways what this is, a bit of a gamble through. I mean, I actually looked at courage as well as forgiveness, gratitude and hope in the PhD, and I did a more broad evaluation of positive psychology generally. So this is a bit of a slightly slimmed down version. But what I was saying there is that by bringing positive psychology into dialogue with theology, I think I was able to see more clearly certain aspects of these virtues or strengths that weren't being emphasised in psychology, and that kind of interdisciplinarity kind of brought it into a sharper relief. And I think having shown that these aspects are kind of neglected in psychology, I think it could be possible in some areas to enrich the concepts with which positive psychology works, to try and emphasise those more collective dimensions and to look at other ends being served by these things, in addition to just the hedonic resources of subjective well-being. I think that's actually the last slide. Oh, yes. So thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, and we've got time for some questions. Amy's on the microphone. Let's have Rosie have the first words. She was supervised by Liz.
Hi. This is something actually we were discussing the other day, and you kind of brought it up again today about the difference between like individual and like what's the word? Collective, not creative, and like the collective dimensions of gratitude. And something that I find quite difficult is to be thankful for things from my day when there's so much going on in the world that's not good at all. I think particularly in the light of what's just happened in Paris, like I feel almost a guilt about being thankful and grateful for 3 things in my day when actually I can't really square what's happened. Like how would you go about tackling that kind of thing? Or is that too, I don't know, let's bring up the whole problem of evil question, but I don't know.
Well, I think it's, I mean, obviously, you're making a point perhaps that sometimes, or at least I think this is what you might be saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually what comes more to you in a situation is compassion for other people than gratitude for yourself. And actually, I mean, my focus in my current intervention study actually is on the connections between compassion and gratitude. And so I think, yeah, you're expressing a concern that a lot of people would have. Aren't I lucky? Right? When actually there are terrible things going on in the world, and it feels difficult to. You're not full of the joys because of that. So I think that it's probably activated in you a compassion for those other people.
So could there be a way of like combining the two, like a new method that would allow one to feel grateful whilst also accepting that there is, some kind of compassion as well?
I certainly think so. I mean, I certainly think that you can give thanks. I mean, I don't know if you pray, but I mean, people who pray could give thanks at the same time as they're praying, compassionately for other people, or people who don't pray can just think that, can't they? Meditate on what people need. But incidentally, your suggestion, I mean, actually it's a very rich question because there's lots of areas I could take that down. But one of the studies that my colleague Dr Blair Morgan and I did was a prototype analysis of gratitude. And we asked people, students actually, to write down what words they associated with gratitude. And it was a replication of a study that had been done in the US in 2009. And this paper that we did is published in a journal of positive psychology in 2014. Now, what was interesting about it is that our UK sample, which was closely matched to the US sample of students, named, I think it was 16% of the UK sample, the total number of participants was 101, I think it was, so 16 of them, named guilt as a feature of gratitude. They actually felt some kind of guilt. Now, obviously, it's just words that people associate with it, so we don't know too much about what the circumstances are, just that people associate them, like you did just then. You said guilt and used it. But the interesting thing was that the US study that we replicated, that feature didn't come up. So guilt wasn't a feature of gratitude in the US sample. Now, obviously, those are only two samples. I'm not saying you can't extrapolate too much from that. We replicated the study in Australia just recently, just in February, and guilt came up again in the Australian sample. So I think what you're describing there is perhaps there's an ambivalence about gratitude in some ways. And we actually know from our empirical research that we've done that people don't evaluate gratitude as an ambiguously positive concept, actually, partly because it could lead to people feeling guilt. But there are other emotions that people have named as well that are difficult. So I think, just to sum up, I think there's a place for gratitude, there's a place for compassion as well. I think, they need to be sort of balanced up, and I think your particular dilemma speaks to that point. But I also think that actually it seems that there may be some aspects of gratitude anyway that people associate, in some contexts anyway, with guilt. So that's the question.
Let's go over to the back there, William.
Thank you. I'm interested to know how far you can challenge the idea of instrumentalising values by the idea that value is in some sense primary, or a primary part of our human experience. So for example, if you say God is love, that in a sense implies that any love we express is a reflection of something prior. If you say love is God, then in another sense you're making love subject to what you'd make it in and of itself. So I think it's interesting that in the Islamic tradition we have 99 names of God. And in a similar way, I wonder whether, rather than saying what could hope do for me, what can forgiveness do for me, to say in what sense does my life reflect the hope or forgiveness that is prior. In that sense, is that partly what we mean by being made in the image of God?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good comment. I think there is far too much of an emphasis, as I was saying, on what might be an if-for-me thing. I definitely agree with what you say, that kind of reflects, it obviously depending on what you believe, but that reflects the image of God. But that's where these virtues come from. And that our human sort of reflection of them is obviously a pale shadow, isn't it, compared to God.
Rebecca, and then we'll come over here, and then we'll go back to the back row again.
It's just a question about gratitude. You mentioned thankfulness or writing a letter of thanks. I've heard it said that thanks is linguistically dependent on the idea of thinking. And similarly with the German Denken and Danken, that somehow you've got to think about giving thanks. And anyone who's had a child, I think, experiences that idea. You've got to keep reminding a child to learn to say thank you, because it doesn't come spontaneously. So I just wondered whether you see gratitude as closer in the spectrum towards just spontaneous pleasure in something, celebrating something, or how much it's towards thankfulness, and whether it's a kind of primary level emotional response, or whether it is something we need to learn.
I think there's an immediate kind of, forget what your expression was just then, immediacy, was it, about gratitude?
Celebration and immediate response.
Yeah, an immediate response. I think there is that. But I suppose there are species of gratitude, aren't there? And the kind of species of gratitude, Jonathan Edwards made a distinction between what he called natural gratitude and spiritual gratitude. And natural gratitude was that kind of spontaneous gratitude for good things that was unequivocally joyous and immediate. But then the spiritual gratitude is the kind of gratitude that's a bit more hard-won, the kind of giving thanks for trials and tribulations. So I think, I can't speak to the linguistic point. I don't know much about that. But certainly what I can say in terms of your point about whether it's something that's got to be learned or something that's more immediate, I think that the species of gratitude in question, makes a big difference there. And as I say, I think even if we don't go all the way with Jonathan Edwards, I think people can see it. Even people of no faith can see a difference between the gratitude that's spontaneous and the gratitude that's more hard-won. And that's kind of linked in a secular term, I suppose, with the post-traumatic growth that I mentioned. That might be a kind of a secular analogue for giving thanks in all circumstances, I suppose.
Yeah, another question. Thanks very much for that. I love this approach of that you're having of positive psychology. A question about forgiveness. I have an issue. What do you do about someone who doesn't even recognise what they've done? They've done wrong. Yeah. And have you looked at it? And I just mentioned that I recalled how Jesus on the cross didn't say, I forgive, but Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. So the first bit of the question was about if people don't even recognise that they're doing wrong. Well, the first thing you'd have to say, I suppose, is, you know, is it possible to tell that person that they've, you know, they've wronged you, or that that's your interpretation of events? I suppose it may not be possible. If that person hurt you and has died, it's a different kind of a mental process of forgiveness that you'll have to go through, because it will be entirely intrapersonal, as opposed to a process that could actually bring that person into the dialogue, isn't it? I mean, it's a difference, if you like, between intrapersonal forgiveness and interpersonal forgiveness, I suppose. So I think if the person doesn't recognise it and you can actually get to see them and say, it's going to take a different shape than if the person, you know, you can't get to speak to them. But that, I think it's not a necessary condition that you have to, that the other person has to recognise that they've done wrong for you to forgive them. I mean, you might want them to, but I don't think it's a necessary condition that you would have, because obviously a lot of people go to have therapy, and that's because they can't tell the person for whatever reason that there's a problem. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question here. I'm just trying to break it down into how it might look in different contexts. And so I suppose I'm thinking that if they don't know it, it just depends on whether you have got the possibility to see them, isn't it?
What I hear is there's no silver bullet. It's a...
Thank you. I wonder if before I go over to Mike, I've got you and Alistair. I had a follow-up question to that on the lines of forgiveness. I wonder if it's possible to offer forgiveness too quickly. I'm thinking of a situation where there was some terrible tragedy, somebody was murdered, and the families of the victim came on television, I think, and immediately offered forgiveness. And I think they were religious.
Yeah.
And at the time it jarred with me somehow. And I don't doubt their intention, I don't doubt their sincerity, but I did wonder if there must needs to be a process of, well, I think, time that happens, or whether forgiveness that is instant is more genuine or better or whatever.
Well, I think it's a very good point that you made there. And I mean, there have been a number of cases, haven't there, where people have said that they forgive in the wake of some particularly heinous atrocity or murder or whatever. And I was once asked actually by the Church Times to comment on one of those particular cases, and I said that I think sometimes jumping to forgive too quickly could actually be a form of sort of defence in a way, that you're actually not wanting to feel the pain and to sort of acknowledge just how hurt you feel. And so, or it may not be that. It may be your identity as a Christian, for example, has kind of predisposed you towards saying, well, we need to turn the other cheek. But actually, psychologically, the necessary processing, hasn't happened in that case. Now, I think there are no hard and fast rules about it. It depends on the situation, I suppose. And sometimes maybe people receive some kind of gift of grace that means they can forgive more quickly. But certainly, from kind of a clinical or therapeutic point of view, I would think it's necessary for people to really feel the pain as one of the phases. And I think, that actually comes up in that 20-stage model, that there's a need to kind of see the offence for what it is without minimising it, in order for it to be kind of transformed later on, but to go to the kind of the depths, as it were, before you go into that. I think some people have called it pseudo-forgiveness, but I don't like the sound of that, because that sound, pseudo-forgiveness to me sounds more like somebody pretending that they've forgiven, Whereas I think you can intend to forgive somebody. I mean, what it makes me think of, and I was talking to you about it the other night, is there's that bit in the Bible, I believe, help thou my unbelief. And in a way, you can kind of say, I forgive, help my unforgiveness. It's kind of a process, I think. And so sometimes I think all you can put on the table is an intention to forgive, and that you hope in the fullness of time that will be realised. But as I say, I don't think you can generalise hard and fast rules about whether somebody has done it too quickly or not. I think it's probably something you'd have a hunch about when you actually saw those people in a therapeutic setting. You know.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to Mike, and then Alistair, and then Sharon, and then if we've got time, we'll come forward.
Thanks, Liz. That's a great paper, and wonderful to hear about your research in these areas. I think it's so important. I mean, quick one on forgiveness. It's always struck me that for profound forgiveness, a kind of death has to occur. There is something, a kind of surgery, a kind of giving up of what you hold against that person. And that has to sort of be put to death, because as long as you hold on to it in a way that you can hold it over them, there's no real forgiveness. And it doesn't mean forgetting it, but obviously a kind of death. It's very costly, really profound. I wanted to go back to the gratitude thing, just to point out, I'm sure you're aware of this, and it's probably in Rowan's book, but some people may not follow that. In Romans 1, how important thanksgiving is as lying at the root of sin, a failure to, Eucharistang is the word, to give thanks and to glorify God. Paul sees it as where sin starts, actually, turning, as it were, away from the Creator and not giving thanks. And conversely, how important the discipline of thanksgiving is just in growing faith. I say to my students, it really, if you want to grow your faith, most people say, well, read the Bible more, go to church, pray more, whatever. But actually the discipline of giving thanks every day, regularly, as you've been talking about, actually builds faith and develops faith, because it really is stretching the muscle of faith.
Yeah. Thanks for that comment. Just a little follow-up to that. You talked about giving thanks.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think there's a difference, and it's a kind of a depth difference between giving thanks and saying thanks.
Yes.
There seems to be some kind of something more sacrificial going on in the giving of thanks as opposed to a saying of thanks. Yeah. And so I think maybe there could be a way in psychology, purely secular psychology, of trying to kind of stimulate that more kind of reflective giving of thanks in a way, rather than just saying thanks or writing down 3 things that you're grateful for. You know, some way of making it more deep. I'm not making myself very clear here, but I just think that for me there seems to be some kind of a difference between giving and saying thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really important to start every day, just recognizing that every day is a gift, that we can't take an ongoing existence for granted. Every day we have is a gift, and yeah. I'll pass.
I'll sit to Alistair and then come to Sharon.
Liz, thank you very much. This is new to me, and much I enjoyed, but I did react against one theme in your talk, and I just wanted you to respond to that. So unless I've misunderstood, part of your exposition of hope in positive psychology was to try and increase self-belief, increase people's understanding of their capacity to influence things. Would you not say that a Christian view would be that one should try and nurture hope in what we can be certain of, which is our God, our Father, Christ, and forgiveness, and actually to nurture increased self-doubt, that is to make us aware of our weakness and our inability to do things without God? If you believe that, isn't positive psychology possibly anti-Christian in that zone?
Well, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say anti-Christian. I mean, my point was rather to say that this emphasis on the self-determined aspects of hope and optimism wasn't the whole story. That's what I was trying to get across, that there are aspects of hope that transcend our own capabilities. And indeed, that actually, because we have weaknesses, we can't just hope for in our own strength. I'm not sure how different my perspective is from yours, in fact.
Well, I think hope in ourselves is very uncertain, or at least it's certainly going to fail.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be the Christian message as I would understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be uncomfortable with a positive psychology message that tries to encourage self-belief.
Yeah, and that's why I was critical of it, but
Yeah.
only because I was saying that it's not really the whole picture. I mean, I think, obviously in the PhD as a whole, that there's more evaluation of positive psychology and engagement with theology, but I think my approach is to try and see what the best that the psychology can offer is, but to sort of see how far it goes, and I can see how from a Christian perspective, it depends on I mean, there's a multiplicity of different Christian perspectives, but to hope in anything that's not rooted finally in God, for many people would be not the right sort of hope to have. But I think, in this talk, I've been trying to kind of look at what's positive on the pun, and what can be good about these psychological approaches, even if they don't go, I don't think, far enough, certainly not in terms of looking at hope as something that's a collective thing.
Okay, Sharon's got the microphone. I think this will have to be the last question, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Liz, for your talk. My comment was actually more just in response to the question that you raised, Hilary, about seemingly forgiving too quickly. But I just wondered whether another perspective is that, when something like that happens, it's a decision to say no to resentment. And although everything hasn't, you're just acknowledging at the start of the process that you think, there will be a depth in time. Forgiveness, in my understanding, is a decision of the will. And so it's just kind of acknowledging the start of that process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as that was such a brief comment, then we can come forward. Did you have a question? Did you have your hand up? And
I was thinking if the processes of forgiveness and all the rest of it were not continuous, there were disconnects in it. So you don't start with little forgivenesses, which sort of build up and build up and build up, and then you get big ones. But you get big breaks, you get big gaps and holes. And I was part of a discussion the other day with somebody who'd been a counsellor, local counsellor. And I've been a local counsellor, and I know exactly what she means. You get these rants from people. You get letters of multiple page A4 typescript with photographs of why they shouldn't pay a £30 parking ticket, even though they're on a double yellow line. And there's not, and she called those high complaining people. And you can't say anything to these people. They literally cannot hear you, even though you're possibly one person who might be able to help them get something done. And part of this discussion was with a gender psychiatrist who had, he suffered people coming in who for years experienced frustration and injustice, a sense of trying to get something to help them with their condition and being rejected and failing, constantly years of lack of hope, lack of maximum frustration. You can't say anything to these. You can't say to these people, just feel grateful or whatever. It's too much. Until suddenly, sometimes it can get to such a pitch that it can just happen in an instant. You can have immediate forgiveness or immediate relief. You can suddenly say, give it up, give up this emotion, give up this resentment, and it's gone. And it's gone as though it's never been. But it's not a stochastic thing. It's not a gradual. There are disconnects.
Yeah, I think
that's what I wanted to say.
I think that's very true. I think obviously if people are going to have therapy to help them with the process of forgiveness, those steps might help them. But often in lived experience, I've had the experience actually of somebody coming into my mind who I'd had some beef with years ago, and realising that actually I no longer did. There'd been a kind of a new gestalt had emerged, and actually I'd forgiven him, thankfully. So I suppose it's to do with whether even if it's an intentional process, people might not pass through all those stages, if they're going for therapy. But I think it's so much more the case, what you describe in lived life, where, you could just suddenly think that you have forgiven someone. I suppose somebody like William James, I know drawing on rather old psychology here to say this, but I suppose somebody like William James might say that if they'd sort of undergone a period of subconscious incubation, then actually, you know, subconsciously you were working on forgiving that person all along, and then suddenly there was a kind of a, as you say, a release, you know. But I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? You know, there's so many different types of forgiveness, species of forgiveness, and definitely, I think a lot of us, certainly I can identify with that type you just mentioned, certainly just realised. And it feels like a real gift actually, because, you know, you feel like you haven't had to kind of work on it too much. It's somehow, maybe that's grace or something, but somehow it's been redeemed, you know.
Okay, I said that would be the last question, and we've reached out of time, so let's thank Liz again for an excellent